Please do not begin interpreting yet. This is a brief introduction. In my speech today, I will speak about the Banshee, which is a figure from Irish folklore. I will mention the following names: Eddie Lenihan, who is a famous Irish storyteller, as well as Offaly, which is a county located in Central Ireland. I will now begin my speech. Ladies and gentlemen, when we were children, we were often told fairy tales. And there are a few unwritten rules about what a fairy tale should look like. They usually begin with the phrase, once upon a time. They tend to take place in a faraway imaginary land. And most importantly, they always have a happy ending. However, during my childhood, not all the stories that I was told were like this. In fact, many of them were actually quite tragic. Growing up in a small village in the west of Ireland, I was exposed to many stories from Irish folklore. My neighbour was a very famous storyteller by the name of Eddie Lenihan. Every year he would come to my primary school and enchant all of us with stories from Irish folklore. He would tell us stories about fairies, and he would teach us not to anger the fairies, or else there would be negative consequences. One story that really struck me was that of the Banshee. Banshee roughly means fairy woman in the Irish language. In traditional Irish folklore, she was the announcer of death. She would come to herald death. This female spirit was described in different ways. She was either described as being an old hag with a wrinkled face, or as a beautiful young woman. But she always had long silvery hair, which she brushed with a comb. She always wore a grey hooded cloak, and most importantly, her eyes were permanently red from crying. But why were they red from crying? Well, the Banshee was generally associated with mourning. She would announce to you that a family member was going to die, whether now or later. If you saw the Banshee, you would be praying for the safety of your family members. You would be praying that they soon would not join the land of the dead. But even if you didn't see her, she would still signal impending death by shrieking or wailing. In fact, some people say that her wailing was so loud that she could shatter glass with it. Fascinated by this story, I decided to ask my father about it. He told me his own story about his own experience with the Banshee. When my father was a teenager, growing up in Offaly, which is a rural county located in Central Ireland, he was working one day out in the fields on his family farm with my grandfather. Suddenly, they heard a blood-curdling scream, and my grandfather said somebody was probably going to die. When they got home that evening, my grandmother was waiting for them in the house. And she told them that my granduncle, my grandfather's older brother, had been electrocuted several days before and had just died. I personally was a little bit skeptical about this story. And personally, I think that the screams that they heard were probably the screams of my grandmother upon hearing of the death of her dear brother-in-law. I hope that you enjoyed this brief story. As you can see now, not all the stories from my childhood began with the phrase, once upon a time. They were not set in an imaginary land, and they certainly did not have a happy ending. Thank you.